Hi, my name is Nicholas Stratton, and my project is on Dr. William E. Cross Jr., PhD. Often in videos, you'll see him called Bill for short. His birthday is not listed that I could find. However, he was born in the year 1941. He got his bachelor's degree from the University of Denver and his PhD from the University of Princeton in New Jersey. If you ever get a chance, actually visit the university. It's very nice and it's a very comfortable place to be. So he got the most famous over a book that he wrote called Shades of Black, Diversity and African American Identity in 1991. So this book was released in 1991. Sorry, I just said that. And it was released by the Temple University Press. And that book was proposed, well, the contents of that book were proposed in 1971, actually. And then published in the book in 1991. And then further revised again in the early 2000s, 2001, if I'm not mistaken. So what this book basically does is it discusses the crossover between social movements and racial identity and how society informs race and how race informs society through his theory called Nigrescence. I heard it pronounced a couple ways, but I wasn't sure which way to say it. Nigrescence sounds cooler to me, so Nigrescence it is. But what Nigrescence basically is the process of becoming Black and how to explain what it means to be Black and how people look at the different stages of their life and how their life has been influenced by other cultures or their own culture, etc., etc. So it's broken down into two processes. The first is the crossover between personal identity, group identity, which he also refers to as reference group orientation, and racial salience. And then the second is the 5-point model of Nigrescence, where one's environment, such as the way a person is socialized, the way they're socialized as a child or as an adolescent, how their identity is formed and integrated around. Within this 5-point system, the first stage, or identity culture, depending on where you're reading, is called pre-encounter. So in pre-encounter, there's a lot of self-hate, a European, Western American centralized worldview, and the person will feel that Blackness is highly negative. And the people in this group are typically very miseducated about Black history, or just typically what it means to be Black and how much of an influence Blackness has actually had on the world at large. Because, for example, a person in this group may think that Semitic people are white, whereby that's not true at all, or that Christianity as a religion is a piece of white culture, whereas it's actually a religion that was born out of Black cultures and derived from Black cultures. So when you think of the first level, there's a lot of negativity, self-hate, probably colorism, and things like that. So the first stage was pre-encounter. The second stage is encounter. So the second stage is basically it's not an identity culture cluster the way that the first one has that, and the way that the subsequent of the 5 stages will be, including identity clusters. But the second stage, which is encounter, is basically when something shakes a person's world up. It's when an outside influence comes and a person will go through some level of anxiety, cognitive dissonance, and basically be forced to acknowledge their Blackness and how that their Blackness affects them on a personal level. So again, colorism and anti-Blackness really definitely begins to affect the person. So I don't keep looking at the camera. I think that's kind of weird. But so an example I thought of for this is when G-Dragon from the K-pop band Big Bang, he basically, it was a couple years ago, he put on blackface. It was so ugly. He put on blackface and a gray hoodie to basically tribute Trayvon Martin getting murdered. And the world was pissed about it, of the people that saw it. And I'm using this as an example to say that if you saw this for the first time, you'd never seen anything like that, and you saw that from somebody from outside of your race, G-Dragon is Korean, he's a K-pop star, doing something like this, and you think, wow, this guy is in blackface and it's 20 whatever, this is crazy. So if you see that and that personally affects you, that might put you into this state of encounter where you're in this second level of identity development in Dr. Cross's system. Next, third level is twofold, basically. It's immersion and immersion. So immersion with an I, immersion with an E, like coming in and going out. So immersion is when a person immerses themselves within the culture, but basically vehemently abhors anybody from outside of the worldview. Okay, so inside of immersion and immersion, under the immersion sector, there will be a lot of anti-white people or intensely involved pro-black people. So for an anti-white example, consider how militant and angry like people that are Hebrew Israelites will act when they first get into their culture, and just think about how they're portrayed in the public eye. Think about that for anti-whiteness. And then for intense black involvement, my best thought at the time was Dr. Watkins, the finance professor. He's like all on the internet. He's very cool. I recommend his work. But he personally prefers to identify as black and put his business towards black people and to benefit black people. And he personally doesn't care if you like that or don't. And immersion is a slightly better level above immersion. So immersion is, in Dr. Krause's work, talked about as slightly better in my understanding of it, to be slightly better than immersion, because a person that is in the state of immersion is slightly more settled in their identity. They don't feel personally attacked or stressed when somebody from outside of their culture will say something rude to them, or if they experience a microaggression, they don't feel it as a huge affront. But at the same time, they may still be struggling with how to. And then stage 4 is internalization. I mentioned Dr. Boyce Watkins before, but for this category, I think he fits better than the last one, because a person in stage 4 may be involved with intensely black identified structure and work to enhance those structures. A person in this stage is actually very secure in their identity. Again, they're not going to really be experiencing self-esteem problems, and they use their identity in a healthy way to uplift themselves and to uplift others around him. And that's something that Dr. Watkins does. So inside of internalization, there are a couple subgroups that Dr. Krause mentions. I'm going to actually have to read these ones so I don't mess them up and lie to you. There are black nationalists who identify as black and use black ideas. There are biculturalists who are black and American. There are racialists. There are racialists under the term of multiculturalists, racial. And these are people who allow allies in from their group and other ethnic groups, as well as white females. And then there are multiculturalists, inclusive, who support LGBT inclusion in white males. In other parts of his book, like when I mentioned in the beginning, racial salience is important to discuss. And I would say that a person who is multiculturalist inclusive probably has a lower racial salience, or came from a background where they had a lower racial salience, as people with low racial salience have an affinity to accept or explore themselves in other non-heteronormative groups like the LGBT community at large, or just other ethnicities in general. And the 5th step is internalization commitment. So a person in this step is fully integrated. They're able to happily live their life. They're able to work with people from outside of their group. They're able to use their identity for positive things, and their main focus will still be on their own group without being negative against other groups and hating on them. Their focus and their power is actually on themselves and on their own group and on their identity. So that is Dr. Krause's Nigrescence theory, where the 5 levels are pre-encounter, encounter, immersion, internalization, and internalization commitment.